So this is a course in Marxian theory, and I want to lay out for you a little bit about who I am and how this is going to be organized. It's going to be quite intensive. I have 4 weeks, every Monday for 2 hours, for 4 weeks, to present a kind of condensed, intense version of what I think Marxian theory basically is like. That means that today I'm going to introduce Marxian theory, but particularly by distinguishing it from other kinds of theory, so that you can see what makes it the unique and different theory it is, and enable you, hopefully, to use Marxian theory alongside of or instead of other kinds of theory when trying to understand the world around you, say, for example, the current economic crisis. First, let me introduce myself so you know where this is coming from. I'm a professional economist. I went to the university and got my PhD to become a professor of economics, and I have been doing that for the last 30 years. Most of that time at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, from which I officially retired December of last year, and I now teach at the New School in Manhattan, New York City. In my capacity as an economist, I have had to learn both the conventional, often referred to as mainstream economic theories, and on my own, I learned the Marxian economic theory. I had to do it on my own because it's not part of the curriculum here in the United States. And a word about that is appropriate. In other societies, including many other capitalist societies, it is perfectly normal, usual, routine for people who are Marxists to lecture and teach courses in schools and universities alongside their non-Marxist colleagues. That is not the case here in the United States. The United States is afraid. As a society, it is afraid and has been for a very long time. So, for example, the majority of economics departments in the United States do not have any Marxists at all on the faculty. A few, in the interests of diversity or balance, get a token Marxist, a little bit like they would get a token woman, a token African American, etc. You get a token leftist, token Marxist. And there are some like that. And I myself have been that in a variety of situations. I was helped in my particular case, which is relevant here, because my education was at the what I consider the premier American universities. I went as an undergraduate to Harvard, then I went to Stanford to get a master's in economics, and then I went to Yale to finish my education, where I got another master's in economics, a master's in history, and a PhD in economics. So I am a loaded product of the best the United States has to offer. And apropos of a course in Marxian economics, let me explain that at no time when I was a student at Harvard or Stanford or Yale did any professor, with one exception, and he was the only Marxist there, no professor ever required me to read, with one exception, Marxism. Just didn't do it. If you ask these folks why, they would be awkward. There is really no explanation. The truth of it is, which they mostly wouldn't say, is that people my age, my colleagues, don't know Marxian economics. They're literally not qualified to teach it, partly because where they went to school, no one taught them, so where would they have learned it? They would have had to do it on their own, which is what I did. From an early age, partly because of my family and partly because of people that I sought out outside the university, I learned what this was about. I was given by kind professors who were friends in other departments or other universities. I was given books to read. They would occasionally meet with me to discuss it. Basically, I carved out my own curriculum because I wanted to learn it. But absent that desire and absent some people to help me, it would have been undoable. So I am in a peculiar position as a an older American professional economist, that I have had to develop in my life a competence in the conventional mainstream theories, because that's what they taught me in school. That's what they tested me on to get my PhD. And that's what I have to teach in many of the schools where I have worked in my life. That's my assignment. Go teach that material. So I know that, but I have also learned the Marxian alternative. My colleagues never had this opportunity. They know what they had to learn, like I did, but when I begin to talk, when I present my analyses, they have no idea what I'm talking about. They either cannot participate in a conversation or make a kind of shorthand in which they are either hostile, because Marxism generates hostile feelings in people, or they are simple-minded. That is, they offer a kind of Marxism in discussions with me that's a bit of a caricature. It's like the difference between trying to talk to a literary professor about a great piece of English literature and having someone chime in who never did more than read the classic comic book about that novel or about that piece. And that's not a very interesting conversation after a few minutes. So that's been my experience. And so part of the rationale for this course, the whole idea of teaching this way, is to try in my own limited way to remedy the defect of American higher education. The fear in the United States about confronting, learning, and critically thinking about an alternative way of thinking. And let me give you a metaphor that I think captures this. If you were interested in understanding a family, say the family of a boyfriend or girlfriend that you have, or the family of a relative of yours, or the family of your neighbors, and you knew that there was mother and father and 3 children, and you began by saying, I'm going to ask the children what they think about this family. It'll be a way for me to learn about it. And you quickly discovered that one of the children, the first one you happen to encounter, loves their mother and father and just thinks that the family they grew up in was a blessing, was the best possible family they could have had, that nurtured and loved them and so forth. Would you seriously think about this person's evaluation of the family? For sure. They were a child. Children study their parents a lot more than we mostly recognize. And so such a child would have invaluable insights into and knowledge about that family. Now suppose you found out that one of the other 2 siblings didn't like the family, didn't feel nurtured, felt excluded, felt hurt, felt to be less loved than the others. Would you talk to that one also if your goal was to understand the dynamic of the family? Would you restrict yourself to a celebrant, or would you feel it was more appropriate to interview the one who celebrates, but also the one who criticizes? I think most reasonable people would answer that question by saying, of course, to get reliable insights, you should investigate both the observer who loved and the observer who didn't, the one who praises and the one who criticizes. You will then have to make up your own mind as to which is the more persuasive, or more likely you'll take a little bit of each one in composting together your particular idea. That would be the reasonable way to do economics too. The point of the story is this. Capitalism in Europe is about 200 to 300 years old. And from the beginning of capitalism's arrival on the scene, as it replaced the pre-existing system, feudalism, that existed in Europe, capitalism, like every other economic system human beings have ever lived in, has had the people who love it and has had the people who don't. That's normal, that's natural. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the midst of the successful emergence of capitalism in Europe. He's a product of modern capitalism as it took hold in the 19th century. He lived from 1818, when capitalism was really coming into Germany, to 1883, when capitalism had become the dominant economic system in that country. So he is a student of and a product of capitalism. But like many, he was a product who became critical. That is, his experience as a mature young person, and I'm going to describe him in a few minutes, was an experience of thinking and living in capitalism that led him, as it did many others, to be critical. And he developed an analysis of capitalism that was critical of it. He believed the human race could and should do better than capitalism. As I say, I'm going to explain it in a moment, but I want to get clear that he's critical, and that one of the key distinctions between Marxian economics and conventional economics is that the conventional economics fundamentally celebrates, applauds, and values capitalism. And Marx doesn't. They both study capitalism. A little footnote for those who may not be familiar with this. Marx never wrote a book about communism. Marx never wrote a book about socialism. He never wrote an article about either of these. That was not his interest. He felt that was looking into the future, which is not what he did. He was an analyst of capitalism. His books are about how the capitalist system works. But he never hid the fact that he was a critic who wanted to get beyond capitalism. And so he's like that sibling who's critical of that family, as opposed to the celebrants who aren't. Let me turn then to Marx as a particular figure, since this critical approach to capitalism is associated with his name. As I say, he was born in Germany in 1818, and as a young man, he came from middle-class parents, and so he did something that was very rare for German young people at that time. He went to college. Something like 1% of young people ever did that. Which was typical in Europe at that time. Mass education is a 20th century phenomenon, didn't exist in the 19th century anyway. In any case, he went to the university and he majored in philosophy. And he got the equivalent of a PhD, his doctorate in Germany, and his first job was as a young professor of philosophy at a German university. Because this was around the middle of the 1840s, it was a time when there were revolutionary changes, because capitalism coming in and contesting with feudalism produced lots of struggle in these societies. And particularly in 1848, there was a wave of revolutions. They're called the revolutions of 1848. They happened in every European country. Marx got caught up, as many young intellectuals in Germany did, in the revolutionary ferment, and this introduced him to critical thinking about German society, which he really hadn't encountered so much as a pretty pampered young student who studied Greek philosophy. His doctoral dissertation was on Epictetus, of ancient Greek philosophy. So he got caught up in political action, like many young people, and it really changed his way of thinking. He began to be less interested in philosophy, although he always remained interested, and focused himself instead on understanding the world as it was. What he called, and others at that time called, political economy. In those days, they didn't make rigid separations between economics over here and politics over there. That was thought to be artificial and unlike the way the world was. The world mixes everything together, so you mix politics and economics because they're always so intertwined. So everybody in those days called themselves, who studied these things, a political economist. That was what the name was given to what Adam Smith did, what David Ricardo did, and what Marx did. In his involvement, he came to the attention of the German police, whose job is always to keep an eye on this. And as he became more and more active, the German police did to him what they did to many young radicals. In those days, the appropriate thing was, you do not arrest these people, you do not jail these people, you do not injure these people, and you do not kill them. That's a more modern approach. In the old days, the solution was exile. What the German police did is they came to Marx's house one day and said, "We're taking you to the train station," which they did. And they put him on a train to Paris. Remember, Europe is a continent where the countries are relatively small and close together. So it's a very few hours and you're out of Germany and you're in France. When he arrived in Paris, the French police had received a communication from the German police. They met him at the train station and said, "We know you're a troublemaker, you can't stay here. We're putting you on a train to Brussels in Belgium," which is another 2-hour drive, right? And so Marx, with his wife, went there, and the Belgian police repeated this happy thing, and they sent him to London. In those years, in the middle of the 19th century, London prided itself on never ejecting political refugees. People who came not because they had committed a crime or anything like that, but they were running away for political reasons or they had been exiled. So Marx joined a very large political refugee community in London, and he spent the rest of his life, which is most of his adult life, as a citizen speaking English in London, which is where he died. And he's buried in the Highgate Cemetery in London, and there's a big monument. If you want to go see it, that's where Karl Marx is buried. He didn't have much money as a political refugee, so for part of the years he lived in London, he was a paid reporter for a New York newspaper about the time of the American Civil War, and one of the most famous and interesting things Marx wrote was a series of articles in which he analyzed the Civil War in the United States, the role of slavery in the United States, brilliant articles that were very widely read and copied here in the United States because the readership of the New York World, which was the paper that hired him, was Americans. So Marx, by the way, was quite familiar with the United States, wrote for American audiences, and so on. He's not the alien that has sometimes been presented so as to create, again, more distance between them. What Marx did was remarkable. He gave up philosophy and began to study economics. And he studied it in a way that began with his political passion. He never denied it. He never imagined it's possible to separate your passions from the work you do, including the intellectual and analytical work you do. He felt the only honest thing to do if you were an analyst was to put your passion out there so people would know that that's part of what you're doing. The idea that anybody could do it without passion would be about equivalent in Marx's eyes to anyone doing it without breathing. That's not available. You stop breathing, you're not going to be an analyst very long, and you have no passion. It's not only that you're not going to do good analysis, you're not going to do any analysis at all, because passion is part of life. We all have passions, it's just some of us are comfortable or uncomfortable with them, and some of us are honest or dishonest about them. Marx put it right out there. He didn't like capitalism. He was going to develop a critical stance towards capitalism. And that made him very different from most of the economists whose work he studied to get himself up to speed to do economic analysis. A footnote here for some of you that may be interested. Unlike 99% of economists in the world, myself included, we have never taken the trouble that Marx took to write long, long studies of literally every major economist that had written before him. There is a 3-volume work Marx wrote that is published, available in English and many other languages, called Theories of Surplus Value. That's the title of the book. The Russian edition, because the Russians put out the most famous edition, runs 3 volumes. And all those 3 volumes are Marx's long, detailed, critical assessments of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and a whole host of the great writers before Marx, whom he studied, and you can see in what detail by reading them. As I say, the only other person that I know of in our profession that ever did that was a professor at Harvard years ago named Joseph Schumpeter. You may come across his name. He was very famous. He wrote a history of economic analysis. It's a book about 4 inches wide, an immense tome, But it's a testimony to that he did what Marx did. He was not a Marxist, by the way, but Marx is remarkable, and for people who are interested in how Marx came to develop his theories, he's basically done the work for us, because in those 3 volumes you can see how he worked his way. But why was he critical? Where did his passion come from? And this is important, because if you're going to understand Marxian theory, then you need to understand the passion that builds it, the passion that informs it, because that'll be part of your own assessment about your own feelings in relationship to this body of work. It's also a body of passion. He was part of a generation born in 1818 for whom the great historical event around which their whole formation as human beings occurred was the French Revolution. Recall the dates. The French Revolution erupts in 1789. That is only 20, 30 years before Marx is born. So Marx is born into the generation that was completely mesmerized, was drawn to the drama and the passion of the French Revolution. To remind you, the slogan of the French revolutionaries who overthrew King Louis, who overthrew the rule of the feudal landlords, who overthrew the role of the Catholic Church as the biggest landlord in feudal Europe. The slogans of the revolutionaries were liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And they brought in a revolution that was to get rid of everything in society that impeded or blocked the achievement of a human community grounded on, founded on liberty, equality, and brotherhood, without distinction of race, gender, or anything else. And Marx was absolutely caught up, as most of the young people of his generation were, with the nobility and the beauty of that image. The interesting thing was that the French Revolution also got rid of feudalism. It took the land away from the feudal landlords. It took the land and the buildings away from the Roman Catholic Church. It dispossessed the 2 great power institutions of feudalism, the landed nobility and the church. Instead, everybody became a buyer and a seller in the market. The powerful became the people who could amass moneyed wealth, not the people who were born into a noble family, not the people who grew up within the church hierarchy. Those people were actually marginalized or eliminated altogether. So the French Revolution was 2 things, if you think about it. On the one hand, the end of the feudal economic system and the emergence into dominance to this day of capitalism. But it was a transition from feudalism to capitalism that was wrapped in a noble, passionate commitment. And the best way to say it is this way. Feudalism has to give way to capitalism, the champions of capitalism said, because that's the way to bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. We didn't have it under feudalism. If we get rid of those institutions, the feudal institutions, if we replace it with capitalism, where everybody has an equal chance to make money, build an enterprise, work for whoever is the best payer, each of us struggling, we can have a society of equally people where our rewards are proportionate to the effort we put out there. All of this kind of talk can be summarized in the view, the passionate view, that it's worthwhile to have, which it was, a violent revolution to bring modern France into existence. And remember, what was the country that copied the French Revolution? The United States. Copied it in the sense of copying the writings of Rousseau and the writings that led to the French Revolution, even though it happened a little bit later, but it was the same inspiration as the American Revolution. Both of these were violent events that were justified in the violent overthrow, in the case of France, of the old feudal regime, in the case of the United States, of the backward old royal regime of King George in England. The rationale, the justification, liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's why Thomas Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, etc. The same language, the same imagery as you had in the one place as the other. Capitalism would bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The promise of the American Revolution in the 1770s, the promise of the French Revolution in the 1780s. Now here comes the punchline. By 1818, which is 30 years later, Marx, who is as wonderfully in love with the image of liberty, equality, and fraternity as anybody ever was, believed in it all his life. He, however, reached a very important conclusion. Yes, the American, French, and other revolutions had successfully overthrown feudalism and brought in capitalism. But, and here comes the punchline, the promise that the transition to capitalism would also usher in liberty, equality, and fraternity had, in Marx's view, been broken. That promise was broken. Those things were not accompanying capitalism. On the contrary, as Marx looked around the exploding industrial capitalism of England and France and Germany in his lifetime, it was populated by super rich capitalists at one end and a mass of desperately poor workers coming in off the countryside, living in horrific housing. By the way, novelists in France, Émile Zola or Balzac in Germany, dozens in America, all over. There's endless evidence about this. Marx drew the conclusion, the problem, the slogan, the hope of the French Revolution is as compelling and as beautiful as ever. But the idea that capitalism was the vehicle to do that has proven to be mistaken. And therefore, Marx, talking about himself, said, I therefore devoted my life to trying to understand why capitalism has been, and as he came to believe, would forever be, unable to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that if you want those things, you have to go beyond capitalism. Capitalism is not the agency that will bring it. Capitalism is the obstacle to its realization. So if you want to understand the passion, it's the passion of the love for the ideals of the French and American revolutions, wedded in Marx to the facing up to the fact that capitalism hadn't been able to deliver what it was promised would be part of its benefits. And I must say, if someone asks me today, why are you a Marxist? My answer would be ditto. That I would look at the 150 years since Marx died, that capitalism has been around, and his conclusion that it failed to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity, then all I can say is good understanding, because it hasn't been able to deliver it now either. The gap between rich and poor in the world today is greater, perhaps, than it has ever been. Whole continents, for example, Africa, sit in a condition that is unspeakable. The gap here in the United States between the rich and the poor, and I don't just mean in their wealth and their income, but their access to culture, their access to education, their access to school, medical care, it's grotesque. We have not produced liberty, equality, and fraternity. Nothing close to it. So it is important to understand that Marx's particular take in economics is driven by, is motivated by a sense that capitalism needs to be analyzed to understand why it hasn't been able to do what its proponents had hoped and promised in their enthusiasm. So it's not a dismissal out of some cheap shot of I don't like you, or I didn't make a lot of money, or it has nothing to do with that. The irony is, and part of the appeal of Marxism has always been to people who believe in liberty, equality, and and fraternity because they feel a kindred spirit in Marx, and they're right. That was his motivation, and it led him to be a critic of capitalism. Let me turn then to how this criticism became, in Marx, a systematic theory. Because it's one thing to be critical of capitalism. For example, you can notice that rich and poor are widely separated, or you can notice that some people have a lot of power and others have very little, and things like that. Those are observations, those are valuable, but that's not a theory. That doesn't explain how and why capitalism should work like that, as opposed to how it had been promised it would work. So Marx began by saying, I want to see what everybody else has understood about economics. I want to learn from everybody who went before me, even recognizing that many of them, like capitalism, are not critical, but they, nonetheless, he did what I said at the beginning today. He did what you ought to do. You study everybody so you can understand the system. So if you read, for example, the theories of surplus value, you'll see Marx devoting hundreds of pages to analyzing the works of Adam Smith, or David Ricardo, or countless people whose politics could not have been further from his own. And I ask you to compare that to modern-day non-Marxist and anti-Marxist professors of the sort who dominate the American university. They haven't a clue. It is embarrassing for me when I appear on panels with them and go to conferences with them, which I do fairly often, that I really can't have a conversation one way or the other because they are simply unfamiliar with the Marxist literature. They never had anyone teach it to them in school. Their careers never rewarded learning this stuff. Indeed, it would have hampered their careers to be seen as interested in it, and so they simply do not know. A problem for them that is particularly acute now, that capitalism is having its second global breakdown in 75 years, when it would be really useful to know a little bit about criticisms of a system that is breaking down, rather than to be nothing but a cheerleader who therefore doesn't have much to say when your team is down 800-2. Okay. Here's how Marx went at it. He said that as I look at other theorists, and I look at how they examine capitalism, and how they come to see it and use their understanding to come up with explanations for what happens, to come up with proposals for what the government should do, and so on, that they have a very particular way of looking at the issue. And here, as Marx works this out, he draws heavily on his philosophical training, and in particular, his greatest teacher, the teacher who taught philosophy to the entire generation of his time, a famous German philosopher named Hegel, H-E-G-E-L. And he took from Hegel the idea that human thought is always, in a way, a struggle of people who see things differently. In other words, if you ask someone to explain the motion of the planets, or why plants grow, or why it rains under certain circumstances, if you look far and wide, you will quickly discover that there are multiple different theories around to explain that. And it's not surprising, because we're different, one person from the other, and we look at the world differently. We don't see the same things when we look at the world. I used to do a little experiment in my classroom where I would teach this to students, and I'll describe it to you now. I would ask students to please look around the room, the classroom where we were sitting, and write down on a piece of paper a paragraph with what they see. And then I would collect the pieces of paper, and I would begin reading to them. And very quickly, the class understood. We don't see the same things. One student would begin writing about the clothing that different people in the room were wearing. That's what they saw. Another one didn't say a word about clothing, was fixated on the architecture of the room, how it was designed, the shape. Another one didn't talk about the room or the other students, talked about me as the teacher. That was what they saw. Another one talked about expressions on people's face, but not me, or the architecture, or the clothing. In other words, to answer the question, what do you see, depends less on what there is and more on who you are. What in your life made you respond to my instruction? Tell me what you see by looking there. Moreover, if your mind is focused on clothing, you're going to not see architecture. It's not because it isn't there. And it's not even that you're not interested in architecture. It's just that you look in a certain way. The same thing happens when you try to ask people to explain what they think about less tangible things. I'll give you an example that may remind you of moments in your own life. The concept love. You're there with your significant other in a very dimly lit little restaurant having a wonderful conversation. And either you say to him or her, or she says to you, whatever, I love you. At which point a very difficult moment begins to develop. Because over the next few weeks and months, or if you're not careful, over the rest of your life, you're going to discover with that person that you don't mean the same thing with these two words, with this one word. Excuse me, you're two people. You each bring your unique ways of thinking, imagining, hoping, dreaming, analyzing to this concept. What he meant when he said it, and what you understood when you heard it, those are not the same thing. They can't be. You and that other person are completely different. You had different mothers and fathers, you grew up in a different community, you had different experiences. How in the world would you ever come to see things the same way? You don't. You can't. Therefore, human beings, particularly in large communities, always develop multiple different ways of understanding what's going on. Sometimes, one among the several ways that people have becomes so dominant that either everybody, for some peculiar reason, decides to think that way, or, what also sometimes happens, is that that one perspective represses or suppresses the others, punishes people who believe in some other way. You all know of examples when, for example, one concept of what God is kills people with a different concept. That's very popular. It has been for a long time. So Marx begins as a student of Hegel with the presumption that, of course, different people will develop different economic theories. Just like it is no way strange that a family with 3 children will quickly discover that the 3 children don't have the same view of the family. They were not all born at the same time. They were born at different times. Mama and Papa were different people when each of them was born. Except their actual experience of the family is different. So it'd be much more bizarre for them to have the same view, and much more suspect, than it would be for them to have a different view. But different views frighten a lot of people. Because if you live in a world of the sort many of you may live in, you believe without ever having questioned it, that if there are multiple ways of thinking about something, one of them is the right way and the other ones are the wrong way. That is a very deeply ingrained assumption in our culture. And it's one that Hegel didn't agree with, that Marx didn't agree with, and that I think if you worry about it a bit, you will probably not long agree with it either. Let me drive the point home as follows. First, suppose I asked you the question, what's the right way to eat a meal? Is it with a knife and fork, or is it with chopsticks? You would resent, I would guess, the question. You would say to me, what do you mean the right way? These are just different ways. They come out of different cultures, they have different qualities, it's a somewhat different experience to eat with a knife and fork as compared with chop. But the question, right or wrong, is the wrong question. It's like asking me which is heavier, Monday or Friday. You wouldn't spend a lot of time struggling with the answer because you think the question is nonsensical, right? And for a Hegelian or a Marxian, the question, what's the right theory, is similarly senseless. Theories are different. A Buddhist compared to a Catholic, we're not going to have a conversation which has got the right take on religion. They have different takes on religion. Okay, I would only ask you to apply the exact same logic if I say to you, look, there's a Marxist critical way of understanding capitalism, and there's a mainstream celebratory way. These are different theories, they develop in different ways, but if I ask you which one is right or wrong, my hope is that you would at least understand why a Marxist finds that question senseless. They're different. They come out of different needs, different feelings, different experiences. I already gave you some of the dimensions of Marx's life that ended up making him interested in critical approach to capitalism as a system. With his critical approach, one of the things Marx focused on early in his life, and that came to shape his economics, was one particular aspect of capitalism that he found odious, that he found fundamentally incompatible with liberty, equality, and fraternity. Here's that dimension. It has to do with labor and work. In Marx's view, modern capitalist societies were structurally, constitutionally unable to provide equality, fraternity, and liberty because of the way they organized work. On the crudest and simplest level, one group of people worked very, very hard, and another group of people didn't work at all. On the other hand, another way of saying it, some people produced an awful lot more than they got, which enabled a whole lot of other people who didn't produce anything at all to live off that extra that those who worked produced. He noticed this because he noticed this as a jarring contradiction to liberty, equality, and fraternity. How are you going to have equality if some people spend all of their waking hours working and other people don't even have to think about it? How are you going to get liberty if some people, in order to survive, have to work like that? How much liberty do they have, and what does their liberty mean if they're too exhausted from so many hours of work and low pay for that work that they have neither the time nor the interest nor the energy to go out and inform themselves about civic affairs or participate in cultural activities, etc. So Marx, at an early age, became really interested in labor. And so his studies were shaped by an interest in the inequality, let's call it, of the whole way labor is organized. And eventually, it became a kind of hallmark of Marxist thinking about capitalism and about other systems, that he began to realize that not only was he interested in the organization of labor, but that other people who had studied economics weren't interested in it, hadn't studied. Let me again give you a metaphor. Suppose somebody was trying to study your family, and they used sociology, and they used biology and anatomy, and all different sciences to try to understand your family. And then along comes a man or a woman who says, wait a minute, there's something seriously missing. I mean, all these studies have learned things that are useful,